Billions in foreign direct investment, massive infrastructure builds, extensive resource extraction, and a deepening debt relationship. In just 2 decades, China has become a key economic player for many countries across Africa. Joining us now to map the significance of those evolving relationships, Gordon Chang, columnist at the Daily Beast and the author of The Coming Collapse of China. Kenneth Kalu, author of Foreign Aid and the Future of Africa. He's also assistant professor in global management studies at Ryerson University. And Lynette Ong, associate professor of political science at the U of T's Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. And Gordon, we're delighted to welcome you back here, and to your other 2 guests here for the first time. Great to meet both of you. Let us put this graphic up if we can, Sheldon, just to set the table for the discussion to come. This is a conversation about an expanding presence on the African continent. Africa is now the 3rd largest destination for Chinese investment behind Asia and Europe. This September, President Xi Jinping pledged $60 billion to Africa. That's in the form of assistance, investment, and loans. He pledged the same amount 3 years ago. There are an estimated 10,000 or more Chinese-owned companies in Africa, and 90% of them are apparently privately owned. Shall we do one more graphic here? Here are the top 10 destinations for Chinese investment in Africa as of 2005 to now. As the map unfolds, you will see Nigeria, number 1 at almost $50 billion. Then Egypt, Ethiopia, Angola, Algeria, South Africa, Kenya, Zambia. The PRC is in the DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, and then the Republic of Congo. China is all over Africa. Gordon, how long has China had an economic presence in Africa for?
Well, it goes back, the relationship to Mao Zedong, the founder of the People's Republic. And then it was primarily political, not so much economic. But this sort of set the table for Chinese investment into the continent. You know, Mao Zedong wanted support in his struggle with the Soviets for the control of the communist world. He looked to Africa because of so many nations there, which meant so many votes in the UN Security Council. And of course, this was the 3rd world. So it was really important. So for today, for instance, year after year, more than half of China's foreign assistance goes to Africa. Every time you have a new Chinese leader, their first trip includes African states. Xi Jinping went to 3 African countries on his first trip abroad as president of the country. So this is a really strong relationship, and the economics have followed that as China, of course, wanted materials, wanted a place for manufacturers, and wanted all sorts of relationships. So you see it as very deep.
Lynette, how come such a big uptick in recent years in particular?
Well, that is a result of many factors. One of it is with changing comparative advantage of China, rising labor cost. Chinese manufacturers are also looking at getting their production and things done overseas where labor costs are cheaper, and Africa is a natural alternative. The other reason is, of course, Africa is also a growing consumer market with high fertility rates, high population rates. So, with the combination of 2 reasons, we see a range of investment pouring into Africa, from infrastructure, manufacturing to services sector.
If people want to know what the investment is going into, we have a chart for that too. We got a chart for everything here. Let's bring that one up. Here's our little pie chart. 34%, that biggest chunk on the bottom, is in transport. 32% in the top left corner there is energy. 12% in real estate. 10% in metals, and on down. You see the whole list of things on the right-hand side there of all of the different investments that China is in Africa. Kenneth, you just came back from Africa a few days ago. Give us a sense of how those investments are changing the region on the ground.
On the ground, like you just pointed out, China is investing across several sectors. If you look at African economies, the biggest constraint to economic progress there has been infrastructure, lack of roads, railways, and poor electricity supply. Mm-hmm. China's presence can be felt across those sectors.
So they're building
roads,
bridges,
airports, railways, and investing in power generation. Even now, China is developing special economic zones, which are like geographical areas, set aside where they build infrastructure to support companies wishing to invest in African countries. In a way, China is finding ways to ameliorate those infrastructural challenges by building special economic zones
What's so special about them?
Because they have a lot of kind of waivers. Companies located in those zones do not pay taxes. They have duty waivers, and they have infrastructure already developed, so they don't get bogged by poor public water or poor public utilities, poor roads, and all that.
So there's added economic incentive to go there.
Yes.
Gotcha. I'd like to know, Lynette, whether it is mostly African-based workers or mostly Chinese workers that are getting the benefits from all of this investment.
I think it's a bit of both. So if we look at the statistics 10, 15 years ago, we could say that it's mostly Chinese workers. But now I think in the last 5, 7 years, things have actually changed. So there's a McKinsey study released last year that shows that there are 10,000 Chinese-owned firms in Africa, and 90% of them are actually privately owned. So it's not just state sector initiatives. A lot of them are actually private sector responding to market signals, if you like, right? And they are providing jobs to Africans as well as providing training to Africans, right? And to go back to the question of manufacturing and infrastructure, and I think they go hand in hand together. You couldn't, like countries like India, the reason why manufacturing hasn't really took off is because infrastructure has been lagging behind. And if you want to have manufacturing sector growing, you must have infrastructure as well. And I think Chinese is going there to get both going at the same time.
Let me get Gordon and then Kenneth to respond to this. China's interactions with African countries, how does that differ from their interactions with Western countries?
Well, I think that certainly you see the domination of Africa, and part of it is because they're providing money. And right now, Western companies and Western countries are not doing that. You know, our aid, American aid, Western aid to Africa is very different. It's more in terms of, for instance, HIV, AIDS, you know, some water projects, very small ones. China's projects, as Kenneth talked about, are large. They're big ones, things that you need. You need ports, you need roads. So, you know, the West has very, very different relations with Africa. You know, Western investment as a stock is still bigger than China's, but of course, China's growing much faster than our investment is. But that'll change because, you know, our companies, you know, even though maybe 10% or so of the companies, Chinese companies investing in Africa are state, still they're the big investors, are the state investors. What you're seeing in the US is that we don't tell General Motors, oh, you've got to go to Zambia. But they will go there because the economics make sense. You look year after year, about half of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world are in sub-Saharan Africa. And eventually American business will catch up. But it's going to take a little bit of time.
Let me follow up on that because one hears all the time about China saying, our relationship with you is based on no strings attached.
Yes.
What does that mean?
It means, one, China does not seek to dictate Africa's politics for Africa. China sees its African partners as equal business partners.
And the Western countries don't?
The West is totally different. Like Gordon pointed out, the West traditionally sees Africa as a student that need to be tutored on the economics and politics. The West will come with aids or loans and attach those aids or loans with conditions. Sometimes through the World Bank and IMF, they might come and say, look, government hands off several sectors. You have to liberalize, you have to do this to be able to qualify for this assistance.
Or we expect certain human rights
yes, or institutional
expectations
reforms,
as
or
well.
democratic, whatever it's called. But China has come to say, look, we are here to do business. We see Africa as equal partners. We believe African countries have the rights to be able to devise their own path to modernity and progress. We are not here to teach you about democracy, neither are we here to teach you about the best, because there is no best economic model. We believe in the rights of every country to be able to, you know, identify what makes sense for them. So that's the difference. Besides that, like Gordon pointed out, China is investing across different sectors. And it looks like China has come to stay. You can differentiate between patient capital and hot money. Hot money, you know, they bring money from New York and sometimes London, put in the stock market in African countries, and once there's a little bit of crisis, of course, the money runs away.
They're out.
China is investing for the long time, at least it looks like that, and that's what we are seeing. building industries, building railways. These are long-term investment. I call those patient capital as against hot monies.
Gordon, do you see anything neo-colonial in China's investments in Africa?
Well, not in the investments, but if you look at the relationship, though, because it is changing. You know, if you step back, Xi Jinping, the ruler of China, is now dropping hints that he's the world's only sovereign. And this is really stunning, but they're talking now about Tianxia, all under heaven. And the foreign minister last September actually made it pretty explicit. Now, if you think that African countries don't have sovereignty because you don't think Western countries have sovereignty, then that's really getting close to the essence of imperialism. But one thing that's interesting, though, is you're starting to see, this debt trap diplomacy that people talk about. Which maybe, from a Chinese perspective, it's sort of like we're giving you a lot of easy money. And that is hooking African economies in ways which are causing debt crises like the one in Zambia, like the one we're going to see in Djibouti right now. So that is an issue. The other thing is that the Chinese have been saying the essence of imperialism are military bases. Well, by the way, China's first overseas military base is in the Horn of Africa in Djibouti, which now has a debt crisis because of Chinese loans. So you are starting to see very unwelcome tendencies in this. And as this plays out, I think we're going to have many more questions, and the African states are going to have many more questions about their relationship with Beijing.
Lynette.
Well, I think the implication about no string attached is that I think the onus is really on the host countries, right, to do the job. And we see, countries like Uganda, Kenya, where there's some degrees of accountability in the regime, in the system. We see the opposition, the civil society, and the citizens making noise about whether Chinese loans to Africa is sustainable. And I can give you an example outside Africa. Malaysia recently had a regime change because the previous government was caught up in a massive corruption scandal. And part of the allegation is that government used Chinese investment to funnel money into the country, and it's a big corruption scandal. The people have spoken and voted the previous government out. And the new government, the first thing they came in was to cancel 2 Chinese investment projects, saying that we are not able to repair. So I think the onus is really on the host government. The government needs money to develop. Chinese money comes in no string attached. So the opposition and the civil society have to get their act together and put the government under scrutiny.
Do you see anything colonial in the relationship that China is developing with African countries?
Not at all.
You don't? Okay.
I don't. And these are my reasons. One, like Lynette mentioned, it behoves on the country to devise their own path to progress. China is basically an alternative to the West. If you look at in the 80s and 90s, almost all public debts in African countries were owed to the Paris Club and London Club of Creditors. Why didn't we call those colonialism? Why did we not call it imperialism? China has even come in a way to say, look, we believe you, African countries, have the capacity, have the intelligence to be able to devise your own path to progress. We are bringing money, but it is your responsibility to devise what you're going to do, to look at how you're going to use our relationship, China's relationship with African countries. It is your duty as national government to think of best ways to use the resources that we are providing to you. We are not dictating where you should invest in. We are not asking you to change your policies or programs and government. We are just providing assistance. We are doing business with you. We believe it's equal partnership. For sure, African countries are borrowing money from China, which this is not the first time. In the past, like I said, it used to be Europe and America. China is just an alternative. I don't see where the imperialism or neo-colonialism is coming up.
Well, go ahead. Aren't you a little bit concerned about the Chinese racism, which is evident? And this is not just the racism of individual Chinese who go to Africa. This is racism which is sponsored by the Chinese state. As we saw, for instance, in that 14-minute skit on the China Central Television Spring Gala, Let's Celebrate Together, which depicted Africans as objects of derision and almost depicted them as primates. which is a theme that goes through a number of Chinese official pronouncements. This is really important. And racism, of course, is not the same thing as colonialism, but it certainly is a precursor for it, and it's a precondition for it. And what we're seeing in China right now are racist attitudes towards Africa, which are horrific.
Actually, you will definitely see pockets of problems here and there. I'm surprised that it's coming from Gordon. Racism, Africa and China. I even see China and Africa actually more together compared to what we have seen continuous systemic oppression and exploitation from the West. So whatever is happening now, it can be just a little bit compared to what Africa has endured over the past several centuries from the West.
Yes.
But, it is still the responsibility of African countries to find ways to devise the path to relationship, the nature of relationship we should have with China. You will definitely have issues. There are pockets of issues. There are labor standards, problems with labor standards, even in the factories that are being built in African countries. But we need African government to domesticate this relationship, to find ways to move along, to create the prosperity that Africans need.
I want to get Lynette's take on
So
the racism angle.
Whether or not the Chinese are racist, and I'm not going to defend that position. I think there are actually a lot of African living in various Chinese cities, and there has been social tension between them. And I think China has a long way to go. Like just 40 years ago, it was a completely closed countries, right? So I think the people have and the government have a long way to go to learn to live with other ethnic groups peacefully. But I think that is a totally separate question on whether Chinese investment into Africa is a good thing or not. I think we need to separate the question of money, investment, development from that of racism. And I actually think that if we improve the economic relationship between the two continents, China and Africa, that would actually help to improve understanding between the two races. And it will help to ameliorate some of the racist attitudes of the Chinese.
Well, let's introduce some numbers here because we do have some on what Africans think of China. So let's bring this graphic up. Apparently, 63% of the people surveyed in 36 African countries considered China to be a somewhat or very positive influence on their country. Only 15% saw it as somewhat or very negative. Almost a quarter of Africans surveyed saw China as wielding the greatest external influence in their country. 22%, a little less, thought it was the U.S. 28%, a little more, saw their former colonial power as having the greatest external influence. And let's do one more here. Almost a quarter said China offers the best development model for the future of their country. 30%, a little more, said it was the United States that had the best plan. Only 13% favored their former colonial power's development model. Okay, Gordon, what are we going to make of these numbers?
I think what we're going to make of the numbers is that people like free money, or they like cheap money, and that is there's no question about it. And as Kenneth and Lynette has said, it's up to the host countries to do their best to make sure that their relations with other countries are on an acceptable basis to them. Unfortunately, it hasn't been the case because there's been a lot of Chinese corruption. Because where Chinese money goes, you do have a lot of corruption, and it starts at the top of the Chinese political system. And it doesn't really help. But, at the long term, I agree with Lynette and Kenneth that they'll work it out. But it's going to be tough. And people at this point have got to understand that China's model probably is not going to be sustainable in the long term. Because, Kenneth, you talk about, well, it's patient money, but it's money which is being extended not for economic reasons, and it's basically political reasons. And if the Chinese economy can't sustain that, then you're going to have real problems in Africa as China starts to withdraw. And you're starting to see right now signs of extreme stress in the Chinese economy.
Well, is there an expectation that with this money will come African countries adopting China's system of governance?
That's actually why I said, when he said it's for political reasons, I was wondering how and why. China, very clearly from the beginning, says, we are not here to dictate your policies for you. We are not asking you to adopt our party systems or party structure. We don't even want to know. That is why China invests in democracies and dictatorship alike across African countries. That is why they say we are non-interventionist. compared to the US and the rest of the West that come and say, look, it has to be democracy. This is it. We have to follow our system.
Well, you can't be shocked that the West thinks that African dictatorships ought to be more democratic.
I mean, anyway, because they want African dictators to be like African countries to, copy what is obtainable in the West. Sometimes what they miss is the centrality of institutions. If you're going to ask a country to copy democratic elections, you have to ensure that the fundamental assumptions of democracy, an enlightened electorate, citizens who are able to correctly interpret, process party manifestos, and make informed decisions, you have to be sure that those exist, those are present.
Do those conditions exist now?
That's a question we have to find out.
That's a question.
Yeah. That's a big question.
What's your view, Lynette, on the issue of whether or not China is expecting the countries that are taking its money right now to follow their political system?
No, I don't think China is actually actively intervening or shaping the political regime in the host countries. But what China is doing is that it is actually investing a lot to improve its soft power in the continent. It's building. It has got 30 Confucius Institutes throughout the continent, teaching language, culture, and a range of things, basically to improve the continent's image of China.
Can I read this to you?
Yeah.
The Economist magazine has reported that members of Africa's ruling parties and labor unions and ministries are being brought to China to attend Chinese Communist Party political training programs. What do we infer from that?
Well, this is also to learn about Chinese culture, right? I mean, you.
Or is it to learn about how to be a good authoritarian?
I don't think so, Lynette.
Well, you can learn about Chinese culture together with Chinese politics. I think they go hand in hand in an entire package. But I don't think China is actually actively intervening in the domestic politics of these countries, which are, I think, two separate things.
Yes.
Right?
One thing
like what China is doing with the United Front in Australia, in some developed countries, I think that is a separate question from investing in Confucius Institute or bringing them to classes with the CCP's Central Party School.
What do you think is going on,
I think
Gordon?
a couple things. For instance, the last couple of years, we've had the Chinese foreign minister talk about how Africa and China should speak with a common voice. And the Chinese are not saying, oh, we should just sort of figure this out together. What they're saying is that Africa should follow China's leads on external issues. Because I agree with you. On internal matters, China doesn't go to a country and say, you have to have our form of political system. But the one thing that's emerging, especially we heard this in Xi Jinping's work report last year, the beginning of this year in March, was that, look, China now does offer a model for the rest of the world. And this is something new. So, it is true, yes, China has not been intervening in domestic politics in these countries for the most part. But we're seeing a much more aggressive, much more assertive Beijing under Xi Jinping, and things are moving in an unwelcome direction. So, yeah, we can argue about all this stuff about whether it's colonialism or whatever, but China is moving very much in the direction that you saw Western countries, 60, 70, 100 years ago.
Can you imagine, Kenneth, that 20 years from now, there will be some African countries that by then will have adopted these sort of authoritarian dictatorships, albeit of a capitalist nature, that China now features today?
Anyway, it's hard to say, but what China is saying is this. If that is what will work for you as country A, say Angola or Nigeria, if that is what makes sense given your peculiarities, if that is what will produce shared prosperity like we've seen in China, China has been able to move hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, not because of their democratic credentials, but because of success in the economic sphere. China is saying if that is what makes sense to you, if the alternative hasn't worked, if the alternative has produced mass poverty and the devastation that we are seeing across the continent, whatever makes sense to you, we believe you have the capacity, you have the right to be able to devise your own path to progress. If that's what makes sense to you in 20 years' time, to a country in 20 years' time, so be it. Or in Malaysia, Singapore, China, these are success stories over the past 3 decades. They were not Western democracies. They are not. But you see a lot of changes, enhancement in social and living standards of the people compared to Africa, which has, largely adopted in quotes, the Western model. So if China is saying, we're not asking you to come with us, we're asking you to open your eyes.
Gotcha. We just got a few minutes left here, and Lynette, let me start with you in this. I'm curious about how integrated the two populations are. How many Chinese people are moving to African countries to make a life there? How many African countries are having families move to China to make a life there? How much two-way traffic is there?
I think there are estimated about 1 million Chinese population in Africa, but I think fewer Africans are actually going to China. So those going to China are on scholarship, Chinese scholarship to study Chinese language and various things in China. But a lot of Chinese are actually going to Africa to take advantage of market opportunities. China is a very competitive market, and they see that there's more money to be made in Africa. So I think in terms of human flow, population flow, we see more going to Africa rather than Africa going to China.
If you're from an African country and you have moved to China for whatever reason, education, job, whatever, how comfortable do you, generally speaking, feel there?
Right. I'm not going to deny that I have read reports of racism encounters by African people in Chinese cities. That definitely exists. But I think the question is the African community has actually grown so large that there's actually a critical mass. So they could actually mingle among themselves and live within the expat community. That there is actually, very little interaction between Africans and Chinese, and whether or not that is necessarily a good thing is debatable.
You get the last minute on this one, Gordon.
Oh, I agree with what Lynette is saying. The question is anybody safe in China these days? Because you see what Beijing has been doing to foreigners. But Africans have largely stayed among themselves in China. The thing that's really important about Chinese in Africa, though, is that many people are moving there not only for the economic opportunity, but also because it's free air. And you hear a lot of Chinese talk about this, how it's much better to live in Africa because they can have a big say in their own lives. It's fascinating that the difference in political systems.
Great. Thanks, everybody, for this discussion tonight. Kenneth Kalu from Ryerson University, Lynette Ong from the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at U of T, Gordon Chang, who you can read in the Daily Beast and who wrote once upon a time, The Coming Collapse of China. My thanks to all three of you for your participation here on TVO tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Bacon is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.